A poor student married a 73-year-old tycoon a week later. She was stunned by the truth. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The rain tapped softly against the wide calf window, its rhythm steady and delicate like an anxious heartbeat. A young woman named Lila Evans sat by herself, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Her textbooks lay open beside her, pages marked by notes and highlighter streaks, but her eyes weren't on them. She was staring at the email on her cracked phone screen. Final tuition notice. Immediate payment required. Her throat tightened. She had already sold her bike, worked double shifts at the diner, skipped meals to save money, and still she was $2,000 short. The clock above the counter ticked towards 6. She rubbed her temple and whispered, "What else can I sell? My soul." A voice answered behind her, calm, deliberate, older. That might not be necessary. Lila turned, startled. A man stood there, tall, elegant, silver hair, neatly combed back, his posture commanding yet strangely gentle. His tailored charcoal suit looked expensive, but it was his eyes that caught her breath. Gray, unreadable, sharp as glass but softened by time. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "Do I know you?" The man smiled faintly. "Not yet. But I know you, Miss Evans. You tutor my grandson at the library." Her confusion deepened. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Charles Whitmore," he said, extending a steady hand. "May I sit?" She nodded, unsure why her pulse quickened. He adjusted his cufflinks before speaking again. "I've been observing you for weeks. You work hard, harder than most people your age. You don't complain, even when life is unfair." She forced a nervous laugh. "Well, complaining doesn't pay tuition." His lips curved slightly. "But perhaps a proposal could." Lila blinked. "A proposal? Marry me," he said simply, as if discussing the weather. The world around her seemed to freeze. The hum of the espresso machine, the chatter, even the music faded into silence. "I beg your pardon," she whispered. "I'm 73, Miss Evans. I don't need a wife for love, only for protection. My relatives are vultures, and my health isn't what it used to be. A legal marriage ensures they stay away. In return, you'll have financial security, tuition paid, and a home." Lila stared, heart pounding. "This is insane. You don't even know me." "On the contrary," Charles said calmly, "I know enough. You're honest, desperate, and too proud to ask for help. That makes you perfect." The rain thickened outside, streaking down the glass like silver threads. She looked down at her trembling hands. "What would people think? That doesn't matter. It's a contract, not a romance." He placed a sleek black folder on the table, the faint scent of leather mixing with the aroma of coffee. "Read it. 1 week to decide. No pressure." He rose, his polished shoes quiet on the wooden floor, and left a business card beside the folder. Lila stared after him, the calf lights blurring through the rain. Her chest felt hollow, her mind spinning between disbelief and a whisper of temptation. "A contract marriage with a billionaire? That's not real life," she murmured. But even as she said it, her gaze drifted back to the card glinting under the light. Charles Whitmore, Whitmore Group Holdings. Somewhere deep inside, curiosity began to stir, quiet but unstoppable. She didn't know it yet, but that conversation would be the first step into a world she never imagined, a world where a single signature could change everything. The next evening, Lila sat on her narrow dorm bed, staring at the black folder Charles Whitmore had left her. The rain outside had turned to a steady drizzle, the kind that soaked through the city and made every street lamp glow like molten gold. Inside the folder were 5 pages of printed text, neat and legal, stamped with the insignia of Whitmore Group Holdings. At the top it read, "Marital Agreement Confidential." Lila ran her fingers over the letters, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. Each paragraph was written in formal language, offering full tuition coverage, a small monthly stipend, and the promise of a trust fund to support her art degree. In return, she would act as the lawful spouse of Charles Whitmore for 6 months. 6 months of pretending to be someone's wife, she whispered. 6 months to save my future. She closed the folder and stared at the ceiling. Her roommate had moved out weeks ago to save rent, leaving the room silent except for the occasional siren echoing from the streets below. She thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs until her illness took everything. She thought about the eviction notice taped to her door and the professor who had said she was talented but needed a miracle to stay enrolled. Maybe this was the miracle, she thought bitterly. A week passed before she saw Charles again. He waited for her in the same cafe, sitting at the far table near the window. When she approached, he rose courteously, as if they were old friends meeting for tea. "Miss Evans," he greeted. "I trust you have considered my offer." She nodded slowly. "I read everything. It feels surreal." "Reality often does when opportunity disguises itself as madness," he replied. "Do you have questions?" Lila hesitated. "Why me? You could hire anyone. There must be women who would do this for money, no questions asked." Charles folded his hands, the movement deliberate. "Because I am not looking for a liar or a social climber. I need someone decent. Someone whose integrity makes the arrangement believable. My lawyers tell me you are exactly that." His calm tone unsettled her. "So, I am the believable lie," she murmured. "You are the truth wrapped in a contract," he corrected gently. He slid a pen across the table. "If you agree, sign here." Lila looked at the pen for a long moment, her stomach twisted with equal parts fear and resolve. Finally, she took a breath and signed her name. "Good," Charles said, his voice soft but decisive. "We will keep this private. The ceremony will be small civil, no press, no family. After that, you will move into my estate. You will have your own quarters and privacy." Lila blinked, unsure if she was relieved or terrified. "And after 6 months? You will leave with your independence, your education paid, and a clean slate." He paused, studying her expression. "Miss Evans, this is not a cage. It is a transaction with a purpose." That night, as Lila packed her small suitcase, she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. "A transaction," she whispered, but the word felt hollow. Her heart would not stop pounding. 2 days later, the courthouse was quiet except for the low murmur of the clerk and the scratching of a pen on paper. Lila stood beside Charles, wearing a modest white dress borrowed from a friend. His presence was steady, almost reassuring. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, she felt the words echo inside her like an unfamiliar melody. Outside, a car waited to take them to the Whitmore estate. Through the window, Lila watched the city fade behind her, the neon signs, the cracked sidewalks, the only world she had ever known. Ahead lay a mansion she had never seen, a life she did not understand, and a man whose secrets she could not begin to imagine. The road stretched into the mist, long and uncertain, as the voice in her head whispered the question she dared not say aloud. What have I just done? The Whitmore estate sat at the edge of the city, surrounded by iron gates and sprawling gardens that seemed too perfect to be real. As the car rolled to a stop, Lila pressed her hand against the window, her reflection merging with the towering mansion ahead. The grand entrance gleamed under soft evening lights, marble steps leading to massive doors carved with gold trim. When she stepped out, a gust of cold air brushed her face. It smelled like pine and rain. Charles stood beside her, his cane tapping lightly against the stone as he spoke. "Welcome home, Mrs. Whitmore." The title made her flinch. She followed him through the entrance, where a butler and 2 maids stood in line, their posture crisp, their expressions unreadable. The house felt like a museum, polished floors, portraits of ancestors, chandeliers that looked like frozen stars. Lila's sneakers squeaked against the marble. "You will stay in the East Wing," Charles said, gesturing down a long hallway. "Breakfast is served at 8, dinner at 7. You are free to use the library, garden, or studio. My lawyer will handle your university tuition starting tomorrow." His tone was factual, not unkind. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. He paused. "Charles, when we are alone." She nodded, the word catching in her throat. Later that night, Lila sat on the edge of a velvet couch in her new room. The room was larger than her entire dorm. A fireplace glowed faintly, throwing amber light over the walls. She ran her fingers over the silk curtains, then over the smooth wood of a vanity table. Everything felt untouched, like a place meant to be admired, not lived in. On the nightstand lay a small white envelope with her name written in elegant handwriting. Inside was a short note. "For emergencies, C.W." and a black credit card. Lila placed it back, uneasy. She did not want his money. She only wanted a chance to breathe. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through the tall windows and the faint sound of birds outside. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the sight of the ornate ceiling reminded her. She was married to a 73-year-old tycoon she barely knew. Downstairs, she found Charles reading the newspaper in the conservatory, his glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up when she entered. "Did you sleep well?" "I did, thank you," she replied, hesitating near the doorway. "You may sit," he said, folding the paper. "You are my wife now. You do not have to stand like a guest." She sat, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched until he spoke again. "You are studying art, correct?" "Yes," she said quickly. "Painting, mostly. I wanted to open a small studio someday, but life happened." He studied her quietly, then nodded. "You should paint here. There is an unused room near the garden. I will have it prepared." She blinked, surprised. "You do not have to." "It is not charity," he interrupted gently. "It is an investment in beauty. This house could use some." For the first time, she smiled. Over the next few days, Lila began to settle into an uneasy rhythm. The mansion had its own heartbeat, the ticking clocks, the echo of footsteps in the hall, the low hum of staff conversations. She rarely saw Charles except during meals. He was polite but distant, buried in work calls or reading old ledgers. Still, she noticed small things. How he paused at the portrait of a woman in the main hallway, how his hand trembled slightly when he lifted his teacup, how he never stayed in the same room for long. One evening, while walking through the corridor, Lila stopped before that portrait. It was a painting of a young woman with soft eyes and auburn hair, holding a book of poetry. The brass plaque beneath it read, "Eleanor Whitmore, beloved wife, 1948, 2002. She felt a chill. When she turned, she found Charles standing a few feet away, silent. His gaze rested on the painting with a sorrow that made her chest tighten. "She loved that book," he said quietly. "She read it every night until her hands could no longer turn the pages." Lila's voice softened. "I am sorry," he nodded once. "Grief is a room you never leave, only rearrange." Then he walked away, leaving her with the faint scent of his cologne and a feeling she could not name. That night, alone in her vast room, Lila lay awake staring at the ceiling. She realized that behind all the luxury and rules, there was something hollow in this house, something that no contract could define. For the first time since she signed her name, she wondered if she had stepped into a stranger's world or into his loneliness. Days turned into weeks, and life inside the Whitmore estate began to take on a strange rhythm. The mansion, once intimidating and cold, now felt almost alive with quiet patterns of movement footsteps echoing through the marble halls. The hum of the old grandfather clock, the faint scent of roses drifting in from the garden that Lila had begun to visit every morning. She spent her days in the art studio Charles had arranged for her, a sunlit room facing the lake with tall windows and unfinished canvases waiting for color. At first she painted mechanically, unsure what to express. But slowly, as the days passed, the stillness of the estate and the fragments of Charles's life began to shape her brushstrokes. She painted the lake at dawn, the empty chair across the breakfast table, and sometimes, when she dared, the shadowed outline of the man who had changed her life with a single sentence. Charles rarely entered the studio, but he often passed by, pausing at the door as if to make sure she was still there. One afternoon, he finally stepped inside, his cane tapping softly on the wooden floor. "You are improving," he said, examining her latest work, a portrait of a garden bench under falling leaves. "It looks lonely," he added. Lila smiled faintly. "It feels lonely sometimes." Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Loneliness is not always bad. It means you still remember what company feels like." Their conversations remained formal, cautious, yet under the surface, something unspoken began to shift. One evening during dinner, Charles asked about her studies, her favorite painters, her childhood in Ohio. It surprised her how easily she answered, how naturally he listened. His dry humor surfaced now and then, subtle but genuine. "You speak of art as if it were breathing," he told her once. "Maybe it is," she said. "It is the only thing that listens back." He smiled, and the moment lingered longer than either expected. Soon, the staff noticed small changes. The dining table, once long and formal, was now set for 2 instead of 12. The butler's tone softened when addressing her. The air felt less like a museum and more like a home cautiously rediscovering warmth. Yet, not everyone was pleased. One morning, while Lila was walking through the west corridor, she overheard 2 maids whispering. He has never brought anyone here since Mrs. Eleanor, one said. And now this girl young enough to be his granddaughter. The words stung, but she pretended not to hear. She had promised herself not to care what others thought, yet doubt crept in quietly. Later that evening, she found Charles on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The sun was setting, casting gold across his face. He looked tired, older than usual. "Do they always talk?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. He did not look surprised. "They always have. People are uncomfortable when something does not fit the story they expect." She leaned on the railing, her eyes following the lake's ripples. "And what story do you expect, Charles?" He chuckled softly. "A quiet one that ends without scandal." "And me?" she asked. "What am I in your story?" He turned to her then, his gray eyes clear. "You are the only honest chapter I have left." The words caught her off guard, stealing her breath for a moment. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. "You should not say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" he asked gently. "Because I might start believing them." The air between them grew still. The only sound was the wind rustling through the roses below. When she finally turned to leave, Charles said softly, "Lila, tomorrow evening there is a gala at the Whitmore Foundation. It is important that you attend as my wife." She froze, gripping the balcony rail. "A gala? I have never planned." "You will be fine," he interrupted, smiling faintly. "I will have someone prepare a gown. You belong there as much as anyone." That night, Lila could not sleep. The image of elegant strangers, flashing cameras, and judgmental whispers haunted her mind. Yet beneath the anxiety, there was something else, an unfamiliar desire to prove herself, not as his contract wife, but as someone worthy of standing beside him. The next evening would test not just her composure, but the fragile balance between truth and pretense that now defined their strange, growing bond. The night of the gala arrived with a kind of electric tension that made Lila's hands tremble as she stood before the mirror. The gown had been delivered that morning, a flowing champagne dress that shimmered faintly with every movement. She barely recognized herself in the reflection. The struggling student from Ohio had vanished, replaced by a poised young woman who looked like she belonged in the world of the elite. The stylist pinned her hair in soft curls and whispered, "You look breathtaking, Mrs. Whitmore." The title still felt foreign, but tonight it had to sound real. When Charles entered the room wearing a black tuxedo, he paused briefly, his expression unreadable. "You clean up well," he said softly. "Thank you," she replied, unable to hide a shy smile. They arrived at the Whitmore Foundation Gala just as the chandeliers blazed to life. Cameras flashed as they stepped out of the car. Lila took a deep breath and slipped her arm through his, the warmth of his hand steadying her. The ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns, champagne glasses, and murmured conversations. Every eye seemed to turn toward them as they entered. "Smile, but not too much," Charles murmured. "They can smell nerves." "I am trying," she whispered back, forcing her lips into a soft smile. For a while, everything went smoothly. Charles introduced her to investors, old colleagues, and board members. She greeted each one with quiet politeness, careful not to misstep. People nodded, some with genuine kindness, others with concealed judgment. She could feel the unspoken questions in their eyes. Why her? Why now? During a pause between introductions, a woman approached a tall, elegant figure in a crimson gown, holding a glass of wine with effortless grace. "Charles," she said, her voice silky and sharp, "I did not realize you had remarried. I thought you were done with surprises." Charles's expression remained calm. "Good evening, Victoria." He turned slightly. "This is my wife, Lila." The woman's eyes swept over Lila with a slow, cutting smile. "How lovely. She is so young. You do have a type after all." The comment stung like a blade, but Lila kept her composure, remembering Charles's advice. "It is a pleasure to meet you," she said politely. "Charles speaks very highly of the Foundation's work." Victoria tilted her head, her smile tight. "Does he? How admirable. Tell me, dear, how long have you two known each other?" "Long enough to trust him," Lila answered without hesitation, her tone even. "And that seems to be rarer than diamonds in this room." For a moment silence hung between them, then someone nearby laughed, breaking the tension. Victoria blinked, forced a brittle smile, and turned away. Charles's eyes glinted with something between pride and surprise. "Well handled," he murmured. "You did not need to rescue me," she whispered. "Perhaps I did not," he replied quietly, "but I wanted to." As the evening unfolded, Lila began to feel less like an intruder and more like someone with purpose. She mingled gracefully, spoke about art and education, and even caught herself laughing genuinely when one of the trustees complimented her poise. For the first time, she felt that she might belong. Near the end of the gala, when the orchestra began to play a slow waltz, Charles offered his hand. "Dance with me?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. As they moved across the floor, the years between them seemed to blur. He guided her gently, his movements careful but confident. "You are doing fine," he said. "You are a quick learner." "Only because I have a good teacher," she replied softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a fleeting second, his guard dropped. His gaze carried warmth, gratitude, something deeper he could not name. When the song ended, the applause echoed around them. But for Lila, the world had narrowed to the quiet thrum of her heartbeat and the way his hand lingered against hers. As they left the ballroom later that night, she glanced back once more at the glittering crowd, realizing something had shifted inside her. The contract was still in place, but the lines between duty and emotion were beginning to blur. And though she did not know it yet, that single night, her first public test as Mrs. Whitmore had already changed everything. The days following the gala passed in a quiet haze of sunlight and subtle changes. The staff began to treat Lila differently, with a new measure of respect. Even the butler, who once avoided her gaze, now greeted her with a polite nod each morning. Yet it was Charles who changed the most. He seemed lighter, almost peaceful, as if her presence had breathed something warm into the marble walls of the estate. One morning, Lila found him sitting in the garden, wearing a light sweater, a book open on his lap. "Good morning," she said softly. "You are up early." He smiled faintly. "Old habits. The older you get, the less you sleep." She sat beside him, the scent of blooming roses surrounding them. "You have been quiet lately," she said. "That is unusual for someone who runs half the city." He chuckled, a dry, amused sound. "I have been thinking," he said. "When you are young, you chase fortune. When you are old, you realize fortune was chasing time." She tilted her head. "Do you regret it?" His gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Not regret, just awareness. I built an empire but lost my family in the process. My son stopped speaking to me before he died. Eleanor, well, you have seen her portrait." Lila listened, her heart tightening at the vulnerability in his voice. "Maybe you cannot rebuild what you lost," she said gently, "but you can still build something new." He looked at her then, eyes soft. "You sound like Eleanor when you say things like that." The words lingered between them, fragile and full. Later that week, Charles fell ill. It was nothing serious, just fatigue, but for 2 days he remained in bed. Lila visited often, bringing tea and reading aloud from his favorite poetry book. One evening, when the nurse had left, she sat beside him as he dozed. The lamplight fell across his face, revealing the lines of age and experience etched deeply into his skin. She realized then that she no longer saw him as a man defined by his wealth or his years, but as someone profoundly human, flawed, lonely, and quietly kind. He stirred, opening his eyes. "You should rest," he murmured. "You have been running around all day." "I am fine," she said, smiling softly. "Besides, you make a terrible patient." He laughed weakly. "Eleanor used to say the same thing." Then she was right, Lila teased, and his eyes glimmered with something that was almost affection. After he recovered, they began spending more evenings together, sometimes in the library, sometimes on the balcony watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. They spoke of everything and nothing, art, philosophy, memories. One night, as rain pattered against the windows, Charles shared something he had never told anyone. "When Eleanor passed," he said quietly, "I promised myself I would never feel again. It was easier to bury emotion beneath contracts and meetings. But lately, you have made me remember what being alive feels like." Lila's throat tightened. "Charles," he turned to her, his voice steady but low, "do not say anything. Just know that for the first time in a long time, I am not afraid of tomorrow." The moment hung between them, charged and delicate. She looked away, afraid he might see the truth in her eyes, the confusion, the warmth, the unspoken feelings she could no longer ignore. The contract had boundaries, but her heart was crossing them quietly, step by step. A week later, Charles invited her to a private dinner in the grand dining hall. The table was smaller than usual, only 2 places set. a candle flickering softly between them. He looked healthier, almost vibrant, and there was something different in his demeanor, calm, confident, almost serene. "You have changed this house," he told her as they ate. "It used to echo with silence. Now it feels alive." "It is not me," she said. "It is you choosing to live again." He smiled. "Perhaps, but I had help." As the meal ended, he stood, moving slower than before, and offered his arm. "Come, there is something I want to show you." They walked through the hall until they reached the art studio. Inside, her paintings covered the walls, landscapes, portraits, quiet moments of light and grief. In the center stood a new canvas, still blank. Charles handed her a small box. Inside was a set of gold paintbrushes engraved with her initials. "For your next masterpiece," he said softly. "Something tells me it will be about beginnings, not endings." Lila looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. In that moment, she realized that what had begun as a contract had become something far more dangerous and beautiful. A connection neither of them had planned, but both had needed all along. Autumn came early that year, painting the Whitmore estate in shades of amber and gold. The air carried a crisp chill, and the lake reflected the turning leaves like a living mirror. Lila had never loved a season more, yet something about it felt fragile, like beauty that could vanish without warning. One afternoon, as she painted in the studio, she heard raised voices echoing from the main hall. Curious, she set down her brush and followed the sound. At the bottom of the staircase stood a sharply dressed man in his 40s, his posture tense, his expression dripping with disdain. "So it is true," he said when he saw her. "The poor student my uncle married actually exists." Lila froze. "And you are?" "Edward Whitmore," he said coldly. "Charles's nephew and the rightful heir to this family's name. Though I suppose that does not matter now that you have wormed your way in." Before she could answer, Charles appeared at the top of the stairs, leaning slightly on his cane. "That is enough, Edward," he said. "We will speak privately." Edward's lips twisted into a sneer. "Privately? Or behind more locked doors and forged signatures?" "Watch your words," Charles warned, his tone sharp enough to silence the butler watching nearby. Lila stepped back, unsure whether to leave. But Charles gave her a faint nod, a silent assurance. The argument that followed lasted nearly an hour. When Charles finally emerged, his face was pale but composed. "What happened?" she asked quietly. He sighed, walking past her toward the library. "My nephew believes our marriage is a fraud meant to rewrite my will. He plans to contest it." Lila's heart pounded. "But it is not." She stopped herself. "Charles, I never meant to cause trouble." He turned to her, his eyes weary but kind. "You have not. He would have come after me regardless. I gave him too much power for too long." She wanted to comfort him, but words felt small against the storm that had begun to brew. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house grew tense. Lawyers came and went. Whispers followed her wherever she walked. Some staff members avoided her altogether. At night, she heard Charles pacing the halls, his cane tapping like a slow heartbeat against the marble. Then, one morning, the newspapers arrived, and everything changed. The headline read, "Whitmore marriage under scrutiny, rumors of contract union surface." Below it was a photograph from the gala, her face beside his, framed by speculation and scandal. Her hands shook as she read the words. "Who would do this?" she whispered. "Edward," Charles said grimly. "He has friends in the press." "They are calling me a gold digger," she said, her voice breaking. "They are calling you a fool." Charles moved closer. "Lila, listen to me. None of that matters." "Let them talk. It matters to me," she said, tears burning in her eyes. "You do not understand. They will destroy your reputation because of me." He reached out, hesitated, then touched her hand. "My dear, my reputation was built on control. Maybe it is time I lose a little of it to keep something real." She pulled away, unable to meet his gaze. "You should not have to choose between dignity and me." "I already have," he said softly. That night, Lila packed a small bag. She left a note on his desk, written with shaking hands. "I never wanted this to hurt you. Thank you for everything." As she walked down the long driveway under a gray dawn, the mansion behind her seemed to fade into shadow. Charles found the note an hour later. For the first time in years, he felt something break inside him, not anger, but sorrow deep enough to make him sit in silence for a long time. Outside, the wind swept through the garden, scattering rose petals across the steps where she had once stood. In the empty halls, her laughter lingered like a memory refusing to die. The city felt colder without him. Lila rented a small room above a bookstore downtown, its single window overlooking the street where rain never seemed to stop. She tried to go back to her old routines classes, sketching, small freelance work, but nothing felt the same. Every time she lifted her brush, she saw Charles's face in the blur of colors. Every time the wind rattled her window, she remembered the sound of his cane tapping along the marble floors. Weeks passed. The gossip about her and the Whitmore marriage eventually faded, replaced by new scandals. But her name, once whispered with curiosity, now carried pity. One evening, while she was closing her sketchbook, a knock came at her door. The landlord handed her an envelope, thick and sealed with gold wax bearing the Whitmore crest. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a letter written in the same steady handwriting she knew so well. "Lila, by the time you read this, I will have made my final decision. I am tired of letting others write my story. You once told me that art listens. Perhaps love does too. I am leaving you something not out of guilt, but gratitude. You taught me to see again." Beneath the letter was a folded document and a key. Her breath caught when she read the title, the Lila Evans Scholarship Foundation. Tears blurred her vision. Charles had created a trust fund in her name for students who could not afford tuition, the same struggle that had once defined her life. At the bottom of the page, in his familiar signature, were the words, "For the girl who reminded me that wealth means nothing without purpose." She clutched the key in her hand, unsure whether to cry or smile. The next morning, she returned to the Whitmore estate for the first time since she left. The gates opened slowly, creaking as if welcoming her home. The garden looked the same, roses in full bloom. The lake still reflecting the sky, but the house felt quieter, heavier. Inside, the butler met her with red-rimmed eyes. "You came," he said softly. "He passed peacefully last night." Lila froze, her mind blank. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, he was fine. He was—" The butler handed her a small velvet box. "He asked me to give you this." Inside lay the silver wedding band she had returned months ago. She stared at it, her reflection curved in its polished surface. A folded note sat beneath it. "You were never a contract. You were the only truth I ever signed." Her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, the box trembling in her hands. That evening, at sunset, she walked alone to the lake. The water shimmered gold, just as it had the first evening she saw it. She sat on the same bench they once shared, holding the ring tightly between her palms. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You made something beautiful." The sound of the wind carried her words across the water. As she sat there, she felt no anger, no bitterness, only the quiet ache of gratitude. In the days that followed, she met with Charles's lawyer to finalize the foundation. His will left most of his fortune to charity, but he had ensured the scholarship would be hers to oversee. "He said you would know what to do with it," the lawyer told her, and she did. Months later, the first group of scholarship students stood on stage at the dedication ceremony. Lila spoke softly into the microphone, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "This foundation is not about money," she said. "It is about second chances. One man believed in me when the world did not. Now it is my turn to do the same." The crowd applauded, but she barely heard it. In the front row, an empty seat bore a single white rose and a small plaque engraved with his name. As she looked at it, she felt a strange sense of peace. Some stories do not end with forever. Some end with freedom, forgiveness, and love that refuses to fade. That night, when the lights of the ceremony dimmed, she slipped the silver ring onto a chain around her neck and whispered, "Thank you, Charles." The world outside moved on, but inside her, his voice still echoed like a promise kept. 1 year later, the Whitmore estate no longer felt like a mansion of ghosts. The laughter of students filled the garden as young artists from all over the country arrived for the first summer retreat of the Lila Evans Scholarship Foundation. Easels lined the terrace, paintbrushes clicked against glass jars, and music played faintly from a speaker in the corner. Lila walked among them, her long hair tied loosely, her paint-stained hands carrying a cup of coffee. She was not Mrs. Whitmore anymore. She was simply Lila, the girl who had once been afraid to dream, and who now helped others do exactly that. The staff, once distant, now greeted her with genuine warmth. Even the butler, who had served the Whitmores for decades, smiled as she passed. He would be proud, he said softly, nodding toward the lake. You have given this house its heartbeat back. Lila smiled. Maybe he is still here, in every corner that remembers. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. She walked to the edge of the lake where a bronze statue now stood, a tribute unveiled just that morning. It was a simple figure of Charles Whitmore seated on a bench, one hand resting on a closed book, the other extended as if in conversation. On the pedestal below were the words he had once said to her, "You are the only honest chapter I have left." She traced the engraved letters with her fingers, her heart swelling with both love and peace. Behind her, one of the students called out, "Miss Evans, will you paint with us tonight?" She turned, smiling brightly. "Of course," she said, lifting her brush. "But only if you promise not to laugh at my mistakes." The group laughed, and she joined them, setting up her easel near the lake. As the sky darkened, lanterns flickered to life across the garden, casting a soft glow over the water. The air buzzed with the quiet hum of creativity and belonging. For the first time, Lila felt that she had truly come home. Later that evening, when the students had gone inside, she stayed behind, finishing her painting in silence. The canvas showed the lake under the twilight sky, a reflection of the statue, and in the faint shimmer of water 2 silhouettes side by side. She stepped back, studying it, and smiled through her tears. It was not a sad smile, but one of gratitude. She whispered softly, "You kept your promise, Charles. You gave me a life to paint." The wind stirred the trees as if answering her. She placed her brush down, walked to the bench beside the statue, and sat quietly. The moonlight glowed across the surface of the ring that still hung from the chain around her neck. She touched it gently, the metal cool against her skin. "Some love stories," she said under her breath, "are not meant to last forever, but that does not make them any less real." In that moment, a sense of calm settled over her, deep and unshakable. She understood now that love was not always about possession or time, it was about impact. He had entered her life as a stranger, changed it as a husband by name, and remained as something greater, a muse, a memory, a lesson. The next morning, the newspaper ran a story about the foundation's success. The headline read, "From Contract to Compassion, the Legacy of Lila Evans." She laughed when she saw it, imagining how Charles would have raised an eyebrow at the poetic title. "Not bad," she murmured. "Not bad at all." That afternoon, she locked the studio and took one last walk through the estate. The roses were blooming again, more vibrant than ever. As she passed the front gate, she glanced back once more at the mansion bathed in golden light. "Goodbye, Mr. Whitmore," she whispered, "and thank you for seeing the real me." With that, she turned toward the road, carrying her sketchbook under her arm, ready for the next blank page of her life. Somewhere, deep in her heart, she knew that their story had ended exactly as it was meant to, with art, truth, and a love that had transcended the need for forever.